The realization didn't come in a sudden, polite conversation or a thoughtful phone call from my parents. I discovered the truth while standing in the middle of my childhood home in Savannah, Georgia, staring at an empty glass display case that felt like a hollowed-out chest cavity. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the metallic flake of my younger sister's brand-new Tesla Model S, which sat gleaming in the gravel driveway like a polished black trophy for a victory no one had actually earned. When my grandmother finally learned what my parents had done, how they had liquidated the single most important thing my grandfather had left specifically for me, she didn't erupt in anger. She didn't shed a single tear or point a finger in accusation. Instead, she simply smiled a cold, thin smile and said very softly, "Oh, that keepsake." I watched the color drained from my parents' faces before she even finished the sentence, and I knew right then that the storm they had invited into the house was far larger than they could ever navigate. I had felt the wrongness the very second I crossed the threshold of the house on street. You can sense it when a house has been rearranged without your permission, especially the home you grew up in. The air feels different against your skin, lacking the familiar weight of memories that are supposed to be there. Sounds began to echo in places where they used to be muffled by furniture or heavy drapes. Even the scent of the foyer had shifted, losing that comforting aroma of old cedar and beeswax polish, replaced by something clinical and sharp, like the smell of a room that had been scrubbed too clean in a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of a crime. I had just arrived back on a brief leave from Fort Stewart. It wasn't the kind of celebratory return you see in movies, with welcome home banners flapping in the wind and a massive roast beef dinner waiting on the table. It was the practical, quiet kind of leave, just a handful of days squeezed between duty rotations. It was barely enough time to adjust to sleeping in a bed that didn't have thin military-grade sheets, and to remember what silence sounded like when it wasn't being punctuated by the rhythmic thud of combat boots marching across the morning dew. My heavy duffel bag was still slung over my shoulder, the strap biting into my collarbone when I noticed the void. The display case stood against the far wall of the living room, anchored in the same spot it had occupied since I was a child. It had been there since my grandfather, General, had retired from the army and moved in with us during the twilight years of his life. But now the glass was sterile. It was too clean, reflecting the afternoon light without the interruption of shadows. There were no faint rings of dust where the bases of heavy awards had sat for 20 years. There were no fingerprints on the glass, no imprints where history had once rested. There was just empty, meaningless space. My chest tightened with a sharp, immediate pressure, the same biological warning system that kicks in seconds before an IED goes off in a dusty road overseas. It was that terrifying moment where the world slows down and you realize your breathing has changed forever. I stepped closer to the mahogany frame. The medals were gone, the silver star, the bronze star, the purple heart, all once carefully mounted on blue velvet, each with a small brass plate engraved in my grandfather's precise, rigid handwriting. The ceremonial dagger he had been awarded upon reaching the rank of general was gone, its leather hilt worn smooth by decades of being moved and cleaned, though never used in anger. The folded American flag, which had never been touched since the day he placed it there himself, was missing. And most importantly, the handwritten letter tucked behind the velvet backing, the one addressed specifically to me, was nowhere to be found. I set my bag down on the floor with a slow, deliberate motion, as if a sudden jar might shatter whatever was left of my composure. "Mom," I called out into the quiet house. There was no response from the kitchen. Instead, I heard a burst of high-pitched laughter drifting in from the backyard. It was my sister Sarah's laugh, bright, careless, and entirely too loud for the heavy silence inside the house. I turned toward the large front window and saw the source of her joy. A glossy black Tesla sat in the driveway, the Georgia sun sliding across its curved fenders like oil. The temporary tags from a dealership in Atlanta were still taped to the rear window. The interior looked untouched, smelling of synthetic leather and expensive electronics. Sarah was standing beside it, her iPhone held high, pouting her lips as she angled for the perfect social media shot. She shifted her weight, flipped her long hair over her shoulder, and smiled for the lens as if she hadn't just parked her happiness directly on top of our family's history. For a long moment, my brain refused to connect the dots. I tried to find a logical explanation that didn't involve betrayal. Then the realization hit me, and I felt that familiar, disciplined stillness settle over my body. It was the cold professional distance the military had drilled into my bones. It was the same mechanism that kept me functioning when panic would have been the easier path. I stepped out onto the porch. Sarah noticed me then. Her rehearsed smile flickered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with artificial cheer. "Oh hey, you're home early," she said, not moving from her spot by the car. I gave a curt nod, my eyes locked on hers. "Where's Grandpa's display, Sarah?" She blinked, her eyes darting toward the front door and then back to her phone. "What? The case? It was taking up so much room in the lounge." I didn't move. I went inside, the case is there, the contents are gone. She shrugged, already bored with the conversation, her thumb scrolling through the photos she'd just taken. "I don't know the details. Ask Mom. She's in the kitchen with Dad." That answer alone told me everything I needed to know. Sarah wouldn't be that dismissive unless she knew she was protected by a higher authority in the house. I turned around and walked back into the house, my boots echoing on the hardwood floor like a drumbeat. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of brewing coffee and the hum of the air conditioner fighting the Savannah humidity. I found my parents in the kitchen, a scene of domestic normalcy that felt like a slap in the face. My mother was stirring a teaspoon of sugar into her mug, her movements rhythmic and unbothered. My father, Robert, sat at the oak table, his eyes glued to his tablet as he scrolled through the morning news, exuding the calm confidence of a man who believed his decisions were beyond reproach. I didn't pull out a chair. I didn't offer a greeting. "Where is it?" I asked. My voice was low, vibrating with a frequency that usually made people stop what they were doing. My mother let out a long, weary sigh before I had even finished the sentence. She didn't look at me. "Can you at least say hello first, Elias? You've been gone for months. Is this how we greet each other now?" I looked directly at my father. He finally looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable behind his reading glasses. "Where is Grandpa's military keepsake, Dad? The medals, the dagger, the letter. Everything that was in that case." Robert cleared his throat and set the tablet face down on the table. "We took care of it, Elias." That phrase, "took care of it," hit me harder than any shouted confession could have. It was the language of middle management, a sanitized way of describing a clinical execution of someone else's property. Took care of it how? My mother set her spoon down on the counter with a sharp clack. "You're making this sound so dramatic, Elias. You always have to make things into a confrontation." "You sold it," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that hung in the air like smoke. The kitchen went silent for a few heartbeats. My father finally spoke, his voice landing flat and final. "Yes, we did." "You sold it," I repeated, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "The silver star he won in the Gulf, the dagger he was given by the Joint Chiefs, the letter he wrote to me before he died. You sold all of it." "It was extremely valuable, Elias," my mother said quickly, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to justify the act. "It was just sitting there in that case, collecting dust and attracting thieves. It wasn't doing anyone any good just being a museum piece in our living room." "It was his," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I was fighting to keep under control. "And he was very specific about it. He left it to me. It was in his will." Sarah wandered into the kitchen then, her car keys jingling in her hand like a victory bell. "It's not like you were ever here to look at it anyway," she said lightly, grabbing a bottled water from the fridge. "You're always at the base or deployed. You barely live here." I turned to her, my eyes narrowing. "That's because I'm serving, Sarah. I'm doing the job Grandpa did, the job those medals represent." She rolled her eyes and leaned against the counter. "Whatever, you get paid for that. It's a career choice, not a personality trait." My hands curled into fists at my sides before I could stop them. I felt the heat rising in my neck. My father saw the movement and narrowed his eyes. "We're a family, Elias. In this house, what a patriarch leaves behind belongs to all of us. We had an opportunity to help your sister get settled with a reliable vehicle, and we took it." "No," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "He was very clear. He told me sitting right there at that table that those items were for me to keep the legacy alive. He didn't want them liquidated to buy a luxury car." My mother's expression hardened, her maternal warmth evaporating. "He was an old man, Elias. He didn't need those things anymore. He's gone. We have to look out for the living." Something inside me cracked at that moment. The betrayal wasn't just about the money or the objects. It was the total lack of respect for a man who had given everything to his country and his family. "And you didn't think to tell me. You didn't think to ask the person he actually gave them to." My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "We didn't want to burden you with the logistics while you were focused on your training. It was a family decision." "No," I corrected him. "You didn't want me to stop you. You knew I would have said no, so you waited until I was out of state to gut the place." My mother pointed a finger toward the window, toward the black car in the driveway. "Your sister needed a reliable car, Elias. Something safe, something modern, something that would last her years. We got a very fair price for the collection. Nearly $85,000. That covered the Tesla and the insurance." I laughed once, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "So you traded a general's silver star for a battery-powered status symbol. You traded his handwritten words for—" Sarah smiled, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "Isn't it beautiful, though? It's the long-range model. It practically drives itself." I looked back at the empty wall in the living room, at the space where my grandfather's legacy had lived for decades. I realized something then, something cold and sobering. They hadn't just sold an object. They'd sold proof. They had sold the proof that someone in this family had once stood for something larger than themselves. They had sold the proof that someone believed in me. I didn't yell. I didn't argue further. There was no point in speaking a language they clearly didn't understand. I walked back to the foyer and picked up my duffel bag. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, her voice tinged with a sudden, sharp anxiety as I headed for the door. "We're supposed to have dinner tonight. Robert got steaks." "I'm not hungry," I said. "Elias, don't be like this," my father called out. "Don't tell your grandmother. She's in Atlanta and she doesn't need the stress. She's 84 years old. Let her have some peace." I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob. The metal felt cold against my palm. "She deserves the truth," I said, "and she's a lot tougher than you give her credit for." For the first time since I'd walked in, my parents looked genuinely afraid. They knew that while I was a soldier they could dismiss, was a force of nature they couldn't control. The drive to Atlanta took nearly 4 hours. I drove through the humid Georgia evening, the air conditioning in my old truck humming a low, steady tune. I preferred the early morning light for things like this. It has a way of stripping the world down, removing the soft edges and shadows that people use to hide their motives. I reached my grandmother's neighborhood just as the sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, casting long, orange shadows across the oak-lined streets. Her building was an elegant, older brick high-rise inn. My mother always described it as safe and managed, which was her code for a place where someone else did the cleaning, and the hallways smelled like lemon polish and expensive floral arrangements. It was a place for people who were finished with the messiness of the world, but my grandmother hadn't retired from life. She had just moved her base of operations. I signed in at the front desk, the security guard giving my uniform a respectful nod. I rode the elevator up alone, the quiet hum of the machinery reminding me of late nights on base, waiting for the doors to open on a new set of orders. When the doors slid apart on the 10th floor, I walked toward 10B. I didn't need to check the number. I already knew she'd be awake. Was never one to sleep through a significant moment, and somehow, I felt she knew I was coming. When I knocked, the door opened almost immediately. My grandmother was sitting in an armchair by the window, the city lights beginning to twinkle behind her. A hardcover biography rested on her lap, her finger marking the page. She looked up at me over her reading glasses, her eyes as sharp and discerning as they had been 30 years ago. "You look exactly like your grandfather did when he knew someone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross," she said, skipping the pleasantries. I closed the heavy door behind me and sat in the chair across from her. It was a sturdy, high-backed chair, built for people who intended to remain upright. "They sold it," I said. She didn't ask what it was, she didn't gasp. She just waited, her hands resting calmly on the book. "The keepsake," I continued, the words feeling like lead in my chest. "All of it. The medals, the dagger, the letter he wrote me. They sold the whole collection for about $84,500. Still, she didn't react with the shocked indignation most people would expect. She didn't shake her head or cry. She just took a slow, steady breath through her nose, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "And what did they buy with the blood and sweat of a general?" she asked quietly. "A Tesla," I said. "For Sarah. A graduation present to herself, funded by a man she barely remembered." That's when she smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, and it wasn't even particularly bitter. It was the knowing curve of someone who had finally reached the chapter of a book where the villain reveals their true nature. "Well," she said softly, "that certainly explains why they were in such a hurry to move me into this apartment and handle the estate filings themselves." I felt a slight loosening in my chest, though my confusion remained. "You're not angry?" She looked at me over her glasses, her gaze unwavering. "Elias, anger is a loud, messy emotion. It tells your enemy exactly what you plan to do next. I stopped being loud a long time ago. I prefer the power of silence." I told her everything then. I told her about the empty display case and the way Sarah had jingled the keys to her new car. I told her about the family decision my father had used as a shield. I told her how they had told me not to tell her, fearing the stress would be too much for her heart. My grandmother listened with a level of focus that made me feel like I was back in a briefing room. She didn't interrupt. She didn't nod at the wrong times. When I finished, she closed her book with a deliberate click and set it on the side table. "They told you not to tell me," she mused, "because of the stress." "Yes." Her smile sharpened into something dangerous. "Of course they did. They wanted me to die without knowing they had turned honor into a lease agreement." I swallowed hard, looking at her small, fragile hands. "Grandma, I didn't want this to hurt you. I just didn't know where else to go." She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin like parchment but her pulse steady. "Child, your grandfather spent 40 years teaching young officers that avoiding discomfort only delays the inevitable consequences. Pain is coming for them regardless. They chose the path. I'm just the one who knows where it leads." She stood up, her movements graceful despite her age, and walked over to a small mahogany cabinet near the wall. She pulled out a thin, expansion folder. The edges were worn, but the labels were neat and typed. She brought it back to the table and set it between us. "When started getting sick," she said, her voice dropping into a reflective tone, He became very particular about his paperwork. He was a man of logistics. He didn't trust assumptions, and he certainly didn't trust the good intentions of people who hadn't earned his respect. She opened the folder. Inside were high-resolution photographs of every single item that had been in that display case. There were serial numbers for the dagger, appraisals stamped and signed by a military historian in D.C., and insurance forms that dated back 15 years. But at the very bottom lay a copy of his last will and testament, with a specific section highlighted in yellow. This, she said, tapping her finger on the highlighted paragraph, is what the law calls a specific bequest. It means that those items were not part of the general estate. They were not family assets to be divided. They were legally titled to you the moment he stopped breathing. My throat tightened. They told me it belonged to the family. They said they had the right to sell it. She met my eyes with a piercing look. People who want what isn't theirs often say many things, Elias. That doesn't make them true. I stared at the legal jargon on the page. So they had no right, they literally stole it. In the eyes of the law, yes, she said calmly. They moved fast because they knew that if the probate period ended and you were home, you would have taken possession. They wanted to liquidate the evidence before you could claim it. I thought of the spotless glass in the living room and the missing dust. It had been a tactical strike. What happens now? She closed the folder and slid it back toward her. Now, Elias, we let them believe they have one. We let them enjoy the car. We let them tell their neighbors how successful and generous they are. My pulse skipped a beat. That's it, we just let them get away with it. She picked up her iPhone from the side table, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced ease. For the moment, yes, I need to track down the buyer. Dagger has a very specific maker's mark. It won't be hard for my people to find where it landed. Your people? I asked, surprised. She glanced up with a wink. You forget, Elias. I spent 40 years as a general's wife. I know every quartermaster, every historian, and every high-end collector from here to West Point. I still have friends in very interesting places. I watched her type. She was as efficient as a staff sergeant. You're incredibly calm about this, Grandma. Your grandfather always said the most dangerous officer in the room isn't the one screaming orders, she said. It's the one who is quietly writing down the names of everyone who disobeyed. She made a quick call then, speaking in a low, professional voice. She didn't use names I recognized, and she didn't offer any emotional explanations. She just asked for a favor regarding a specific sale in the Savannah area involving military memorabilia. When she hung up, she looked at me and said, I'll handle the logistics of the recovery. You have a different role. I felt a flicker of guilt. I don't want you dragged into this drama. I can handle Dad. She laughed softly, a dry, melodic sound. Family drama dragged me into this the second they sold a piece of my husband's soul to buy a car Sarah will probably crash within a year. No, Elias, this is about justice. We sat in silence for a while after that. Outside, the sounds of Atlanta traffic hummed 10 stories below us. What do? I asked finally. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand again. You go back to Fort Stewart. You do your job. You don't argue with them, you don't send angry texts, and you don't explain your position. You treat them with the same polite, distant respect you'd give a stranger. I nodded, though it felt against my nature. As I stood up to leave, she added, and Elias, when they eventually invite you over to celebrate that new car, and they will, because people like that need an audience for their success, you make sure you're there. I paused at the door, my duffel bag in hand. Why would I want to watch them celebrate what they stole? Her eyes held mine, sharp and unwavering. Because, she said, some lessons require witnesses, and I want you to be there to see the moment the bill comes due. I left her apartment feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't losing something anymore. I was part of a counteroffensive. The next few weeks were the hardest part. In the military, we are trained for action. You see a problem, you develop a solution, and you execute. Waiting is a different kind of torture. I returned to the base and threw myself into my routine. I let the muscle memory of the job take over. My mornings began at 4:30, the air cold and damp as we did our PT runs. I focused on the sound of my own breathing, the rhythmic slap of boots on the pavement, and the barked cadences of the drill instructors. At night, when the barracks went quiet, my mind would wander back to that empty display case. I thought about my grandfather's hands. They were large, steady hands that had held maps, weapons, and occasionally my much smaller hands when I was a boy. I remembered the day he'd placed the medals in that case. He hadn't done it to show off his bravery. He'd done it so we would remember that sometimes, doing the right thing cost you something. He'd chosen me to receive them because he saw that same trait in me. It wasn't favoritism. It was a transfer of responsibility. Meanwhile, Sarah was living her best life on social media. My phone would buzz constantly with notifications. She posted photos of the Tesla almost every day. There was Sarah posing with a cup in the driver's seat. There was Sarah showing off the autopilot feature on the highway. One photo, captioned "Hard work pays off." Blessed, featured her hand on the steering wheel, her nails freshly manicured, with the Tesla logo prominently in the center. My parents would always be the first to comment with heart emojis and "so proud of you, honey." Not once did they mention the cost. Not once did they mention Grandpa. They had edited him out of the story entirely, replacing a lifetime of service with a 36-month car loan. I followed my grandmother's orders to the letter. I didn't comment. I didn't like the photos. I didn't even respond to the family group chat when they talked about how smooth the car drove. Silence was my discipline. About a month into this Cold War, my mother called. I watched the phone vibrate on my footlocker for 3 rings before I picked it up. "Elias, are you there?" she asked, her voice sounding forced and overly cheerful. "I'm here, Mom." "We're having a little get-together this Saturday," she said. "Just a small party in the backyard. Robert is grilling, and Sarah wants to show everyone the car properly. We really want you to come. It's been too long since we were all together." There was no apology in her voice, no mention of our last conversation. She was trying to pave over the past with a layer of forced normalcy. I stared at the wall of the barracks, seeing the image of my grandmother's sharp smile in my mind. "I'll be there," I said. I didn't add anything else. I didn't ask who was coming or what time. I just hung up. The call from my grandmother came the next morning. She sounded as though she were discussing the weather. "They've planned their little celebration, I hear." "Yes, this Saturday." "Good," she said. "They think the party is for the car. They think they've successfully transitioned into their new reality." I told them I'd go. "Good, I've invited a few guests of my own," she said. "Old friends of people who would be very interested to see how his legacy is being honored." "Who are you bringing, Grandma?" "Just a few people who understand the value of a contract," she replied. "And Elias, bring your dress uniform. Yura, I want you to look the part." The drive back to Savannah that Saturday felt different than the last one. I wasn't anxious. Anxiety comes from uncertainty, and I was no longer uncertain. This felt like a tactical deployment. I was moving into position, and I knew exactly where the exits were. When I pulled up to the the street was already lined with cars. I could hear music playing from the backyard, something upbeat and modern. The Tesla was parked right in the center of the driveway, washed and waxed until it shone like a dark mirror. A large red bow had been tied to one of the side mirrors, a ridiculous, flamboyant touch that made the whole thing look like a game show prize. I sat in my truck for a moment, looking at the house. I thought about my grandfather's funeral at Arlington. I remembered the sound of the 21-gun salute echoing through the trees and the way the sun had glinted off the brass of the casket. I remembered the weight of the folded flag when the officer had handed it to my grandmother. She hadn't flinched then, and I wasn't going to flinch now. I stepped out of the truck, my dress blues crisp and perfect. I could feel the weight of the fabric and the metals on my own chest. I squared my shoulders and walked toward the gate. The backyard was a picture of suburban success. There were string lights draped between the trees and a professional-grade grill billowing smoke. Neighbors I barely recognized were standing around with plastic cups of wine, laughing at stories I didn't care about. Sarah was the center of attention, leaning against the hood of the Tesla and holding court like a queen. She spotted me first. Her eyes raked over my uniform and she smirked. "A bit much for a barbecue, don't you think, Elias? You really had to wear the whole suit." "It's a uniform, Sarah," I said, "not a suit." My parents hurried over, my mother looking slightly uncomfortable as she took in my appearance. She gave me a stiff hug, careful not to wrinkle my jacket. My father clapped me on the shoulder, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Glad you could make it, son," Robert said. "We weren't sure if you'd be free. Grab a plate. The brisket is almost done." "I'm fine for now," I said, my eyes scanning the crowd. The party continued for about 20 minutes, the atmosphere thick with superficial compliments about the car's acceleration and the sleekness of its design. Sarah was in her element, basking in the envy of her friends. Then the side gate opened, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. I heard the sound first, the silence that followed as people stopped talking. My grandmother walked in, her posture as straight as a bayonet. She was wearing a pale silk blouse and dark slacks, looking every bit the general's widow. Beside her was a man in a well-tailored navy suit, carrying a slim leather folder under his arm. Behind them was a woman I recognized from the Savannah Historical Society, along with an older man who had served with my grandfather in the 82nd Airborne. My mother's face went white. "Mom, you didn't tell us you were coming, we would have picked you up." Smiled pleasantly, but the warmth didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I didn't want to be a bother, and besides, I was invited." She looked at me, a silent passing between us. My father cleared his throat, his hand tightening around his drink. "Who are your friends, Mom? Is this a reunion?" My grandmother gestured to the backyard. "In a way, yes. It seems we are all here to celebrate a significant purchase." She turned to the man in the suit and nodded. And just like that, the party stopped being a party. It didn't happen with a shout or a dramatic gesture. The music was still playing, but no one was listening to it. The air felt heavy, as if the humidity had suddenly doubled. Everyone's attention was fixed on the small woman standing in the center of the lawn. "I won't take much of your time," my grandmother said, her voice carrying easily across the yard without her having to raise it. "But there is a small matter of business that needs to be addressed before the festivities continue." Sarah frowned, her hand still resting on the hood of the Tesla. "Grandma, this isn't the time for family stuff. We're in the middle of a party." "Oh, Sarah," my grandmother said gently, "it is exactly the time." She looked at the man in the suit. He stepped forward and opened the leather folder. The sound of the paper sliding out was the only thing anyone could hear. "I will be brief," my grandmother said. "The military collection left behind by my husband, General, was not a generic family heirloom. It was not a pot of gold for whoever got to the display case first." My mother stepped forward, her voice a desperate whisper. "Mom, please, let's talk about this inside, not in front of everyone." "There is nothing to say in private that cannot be said in the light of day," replied. "The collection was a specific bequest. It was documented, appraised, and placed into a trust years ago. It had one clear beneficiary." She turned and looked directly at me. "My grandson, Elias." The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some of them looking down at their feet. My father shook his head, a look of stubborn denial crossing his face. That's not how we understood the will, Mom. We were told the estate was to be handled for the benefit of the children. Understanding is not the same as ownership, Robert, my grandmother said. The lawyer stepped forward now, his voice even and practiced. My name is David Miller, representing the Legacy Trust. The items from the General's collection were sold to a private collector in South Carolina 3 weeks ago. However, that sale was conducted without legal authority. Sarah laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. This is insane. It was just some old medals and a knife. It was $84,500 worth of stolen property, Sarah, my grandmother said, her voice finally losing its gentleness and taking on the hard edge of a commanding officer. The buyer has been that the sale is under legal dispute. He has already agreed to return the items in exchange for the return of his funds. My mother's hands began to tremble. We don't have the money anymore, Mom. We spent it on the car, you know that. I do know that, my grandmother said, which brings us to the vehicle. She gestured toward the Tesla sitting in the driveway. Since the funds used to purchase this car were derived from the illegal sale of trust assets, this vehicle is now legally considered a part of the trust's property. It is essentially an asset of the estate of Elias. Sarah's face went from pale to a deep, angry red. You can't take my car, it's in my name. Actually, the lawyer said, holding up a document, it was purchased with a cashier's check that we have successfully traced back to the sale of the collection. We have filed a lien against the title this morning. This is cruel, my mother whispered, her eyes filling with tears of embarrassment as the neighbors began to quietly slip away toward the side gate. You're doing this to your own family. No, my grandmother said softly. I am doing this and I am doing it for the only person in this family who actually understands what he stood for. I felt a strange sense of alignment then. It wasn't the rush of revenge I had expected, it was just the quiet satisfaction of the truth being told. I stepped forward, my voice steady. My grandfather didn't leave me those things because I'm his favorite, I said, looking at my parents. He left them to me because he knew I would protect them. He knew that to you, they were just objects with a price tag. To me, they're a standard to live up to. Sarah scoffed, her voice cracking. You're never even here, what are you going to do? Keep them in a locker at the base? I'm going to keep them exactly where they belong, I said. And I won't have to worry about them being traded for a battery and some leather seats. My grandmother looked at the lawyer and then back at my parents. You sold something you did not own. You benefited from it, and now you will undo that benefit. The car will be sold to reimburse the collector, and the collection will be returned to Elias. My father's voice was thick with resentment. You're choosing him over your own daughter, over your granddaughter. My grandmother didn't hesitate. I am choosing what is right, and if you can't see the difference, Robert, then you never really knew the man whose house you're living in. The yard was nearly empty now. The music had been turned off, leaving only the sound of the cicadas in the trees. The party was over, but the fallout was just beginning. My grandmother turned to me and squeezed my arm. It's in motion now, Elias, she said. Thank you, Grandma. Don't thank me, she said, looking at my parents one last time. Thank your grandfather, he's the one who made sure the paperwork was bulletproof. The silence that followed the party's collapse wasn't a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that precedes a massive structural failure. Once the music died and the last of the confused neighbors had shuffled out through the side gate, what remained wasn't a conversation, but the cold machinery of the law. That is the part of justice that people rarely discuss in movies or books. They imagine the dramatic exits and the witty closing lines, but they don't picture the endless trail of paperwork that follows. They don't see the formal demand letters, the certified mail envelopes that require a signature, and bring a sense of dread to the person holding the pen, or the long, sterile emails with subject lines like notice of asset seizure and formal demand for restitution. They don't picture the dates, the rigid deadlines, and the blue ink signatures that turn a family dispute into a state-recognized obligation. But that is exactly where the reality of the situation began to settle into the bones of my parents' house. My grandmother handled the entire process with the same calm, lethal precision she had brought to the backyard in Savannah. She didn't gloat about her victory, nor did she spend her time lecturing my parents on their moral failings. Instead, she spent her mornings at her mahogany kitchen table her reading glasses perched low on the bridge of her nose. I watched her one afternoon while I was on a weekend pass, her hand moving steadily as she organized a thick stack of documents into neat, categorized piles. One pile was for the high-end collector in Charleston who had unwittingly purchased stolen goods. One pile was for the bank that held the lien on the Tesla, and one particularly thick pile was reserved for my parents. She slid the final document into a folder and closed it with a soft, final thud. "They are going to be very tired soon, Elias," she said, her voice devoid of malice but full of a hard-earned truth. "The weight of a lie is much heavier when the government starts measuring it." I understood exactly what she meant about a week later. My mother showed up at the door of my small off-base apartment near Fort Stewart without any prior warning. This wasn't a visit to my grandmother's house where she could put on a front. She came to me. When I opened the door and saw her standing there in the humid Georgia afternoon, I barely recognized the woman who had raised me. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was pulled back in a hasty, messy knot. Her eyes were rimmed with a deep, bruised red, not from a sudden burst of tears, as my mother rarely allowed herself that kind of vulnerability, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that sets in when your usual social tools and manipulations stop working. "I just need a minute, Elias," she said, already stepping past me into the small living room before I could even offer a greeting. "Just 1 minute to talk to you." I didn't try to stop her. I didn't have the energy for a confrontation. She sat on the very edge of my thrift store couch, her posture stiff as if she wasn't entirely sure she still deserved to occupy space in my life. Her hands were twisted together in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. "We're losing the house, Elias," she said. The words hung in the air, bare and unadorned, lacking the usual dramatic flair she used to garner sympathy. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't offer a platitude. I just waited, leaning against the kitchen counter, letting the silence do its work. "The attorneys are saying the repayment has to be made in full immediately," she continued, her voice rising in a thin, frantic pitch. "The accounts we used to funnel the money, the ones where we deposited the check from the sale, they've been flagged for fraud. Everything we have is frozen until the trust is made whole. We can't even pay the property taxes on street." I nodded slowly, the logic of the situation clear to me even if it was devastating to her. That is generally what happens when money changes hands through an illegal sale of trust assets, Mom. It's called asset tracing. She flinched as if I had struck her. "We didn't know it would be like this. We thought we were just moving things around to help Sarah. We thought it was all within the family." "You didn't ask," I replied evenly. "You didn't ask because you knew what the answer would be. You didn't want the truth, you wanted the car." Her voice broke then, just slightly, a crack in the porcelain mask. "Your sister is blaming us for everything. She's saying we ruined her credit, that we made her a target for the lawyers. She won't even speak to your father." I felt a ghost of a smile pull at the corners of my mouth, but I suppressed it. "And Dad, how is he handling the family decision now?" She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. "He's angry at everyone. He's angry at the bank, he's angry at the collector, he's angry at me. But mostly, I think he's finally starting to be angry at himself for listening to Sarah." There it was, the part of the story I had been waiting for. It wasn't the total remorse I had hoped for, but it was regret. It wasn't regret for the betrayal of my grandfather's memory, or for the way they had treated me like an outsider in my own home. It was the sharp, stinging regret of people who had miscalculated the cost of their greed and were now being forced to pay the retail price. You could tell your grandmother to stop this, Elias, my mother said quietly, looking up at me with pleading eyes. She'd listen to you. If you told her you didn't want the money back, if you told her you just wanted peace, she'd call off the lawyers. We could save the house. I met her gaze with a level of detachment that I had learned on the firing range, focusing only on the target, ignoring the noise around me. No, she wouldn't, I said. Doesn't take orders from me. And even if she did, Mom, I wouldn't ask her to stop. This isn't a game of chicken, it's a consequence. Her shoulders sagged, the last of her energy seemingly draining out of her. I raised you better than this, she whispered, a final, weak attempt at a guilt trip. I raised you to care about your family. I stood up and walked toward the door, holding it open for her. Actually, you raised me to respect what doesn't belong to me. You raised me to believe that a man's word and his legacy are the only things he truly owns. I'm just practicing what the family used to preach. She left without saying another word, her silhouette disappearing into the bright, unforgiving Georgia sun. The next casualty in this slow-motion wreck was my sister Sarah's absolute certainty that the world owed her everything. She called me late one Tuesday night, her voice sounding unsteady and thin in a way I had never heard before. The bravado she had displayed in the backyard, leaning against the Tesla with a drink in her hand, had completely evaporated. They're taking everything, Elias, she snapped the second I answered, though the anger felt more like a shield for her panic. Do you have any idea what it feels like to have a tow truck show up at your apartment in front of all your friends? Do you know how humiliating it is to have people watch your car being repossessed? I lay back on my bunk, looking up at the shadows on the ceiling. Actually, Sarah, I do. I know exactly what it feels like to walk into a room and realize that something incredibly valuable to you has been taken without your consent. I believe I described that feeling to you a month ago. She was quiet for a long moment, the only sound on the line being her heavy, ragged breathing. I didn't think it would end like this. I thought it was just a car. I thought Grandpa would have wanted me to be happy. I didn't think it would begin like that, I said, my voice hardening. I didn't think you would look at a silver star and see a down payment. Grandpa wanted us to be honorable, Sarah. Happiness was supposed to be a byproduct of that, not a replacement for it. She hung up on me then, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to call her back. I didn't feel the need to fix her problems or apologize for her discomfort. The silence on the other end of the line felt like a border being drawn, a clear line between who we were and who we had become. 3 days later, the keepsake finally came home. It didn't arrive in the back of my parents' SUV, and it wasn't handed over with a sheepish apology. It arrived via a professional courier service in a reinforced, climate-controlled case. The man delivering it handled the container with a level of reverence usually reserved for fine art or religious relics, which, in a way, it was. My grandmother insisted that we open it together at her dining table in Atlanta. She sat across from me as I carefully unlatched the heavy transit case. The room felt strangely pressurized, as if the air itself was holding its breath. When I lifted the lid, the first thing that caught the light was the medals. They were still mounted on their blue velvet, the silver star, the bronze star, and the purple heart gleaming under the dining room chandelier. Then came the ceremonial dagger, its dark leather hilt and polished steel blade looking as pristine as the day had first received it. And finally, at the very bottom, protected by a plastic sleeve, was the letter. My hands were visibly shaking as I took the paper out. The crease in the middle was sharp, the ink still dark and commanding. If you're reading this, Elias, it began, his familiar, rigid handwriting filling the page, it means you didn't flinch when it mattered. It means you understood that some things are meant to be carried, not spent. I had to stop for a second, a lump forming in my throat that felt like a physical weight. My grandmother reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was cool, her grip steady. He knew Ilya's, she said softly, her eyes reflecting the light from the metals. He knew exactly who they were, and he knew exactly who you were. He didn't leave this to you as a gift, he left it to you as a test, and he knew you would pass. I read the rest of the letter in silence. He had written about the nature of service, how it wasn't about the awards or the rank, but about the integrity of the man in the uniform. He had written about how family isn't always defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the respect you show to the people who came before you. He had predicted, with the chilling accuracy of a seasoned strategist, that there would come a day when I would have to stand alone against the people who were supposed to be on my side. The legal fallout escalated with a brutal efficiency over the next month. The buyer in Charleston, a man of significant means and even more significant pride, had been furious about being sold, clouded property. He had demanded his money back immediately, along with his legal fees, and he had the resources to make sure he got it. My parents scrambled to liquidate whatever they could. They emptied their savings, they cashed in small retirement accounts, and they called in favors that left their social standing in Savannah shredded. When it still wasn't enough to satisfy the trust and the collector, the asset of the estate, the black Tesla, became the primary leverage. One gray, drizzly Tuesday morning, the Tesla disappeared from the driveway on street for the last time. There was no red ribbon, no celebratory photos for Instagram, and no sense of triumph. There was just an empty, wet space on the gravel where my sister's unearned certainty used to be. My father came by my grandmother's apartment unannounced that afternoon, looking for a reprieve that he must have known wasn't coming. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked like a man whose authority had been built on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in. He stood in the foyer of my grandmother's home, his coat damp from the rain, looking at us both as we sat in the living room. "You didn't have to let it go this far, Mom," he said, his voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and shame. "We could have worked something out. You didn't have to destroy us." Didn't even stand up. She looked at him with the same clinical gaze she would use on a broken appliance. "You didn't have to steal from your own child, Robert. You didn't have to treat honor like spare change you found in a couch cushion. You chose the stakes of this game the moment you opened that display case." His mouth tightened into a thin line, and for a second, I saw a flash of the old Robert, the man who believed he was the master of his domain. He looked at me, his eyes full of a cold, distant resentment. "You could have stopped her, Elias. You're the one who started this by running to her like a child." I shook my head, feeling a profound sense of pity for him that I hadn't expected. "I didn't start this, Dad. I just refused to participate in the lie. I didn't run to anyone. I reported a theft. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should examine why you felt comfortable committing it." He left without another word, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. It was the last time he would ever set foot in my grandmother's house. The house I had grown up in, the beautiful, historic home on street, didn't belong to my parents in any meaningful way after that. Titles, trusts, and liens have a cold way of clarifying the reality of ownership. To cover the remaining debts and the massive legal fees they had incurred trying to fight the trust, my parents had to put the house on the market. Their plans for a comfortable, social retirement in Savannah were revised, their permissions were revoked by the bank, and their futures were drastically adjusted to fit a much smaller reality. My sister Sarah moved out of her expensive apartment within a month, her social media accounts going silent, as she was forced to take a second job to cover the remaining balance on her graduation gift that she no longer possessed. My parents followed soon after, moving into a small rental on the outskirts of town, far away from the neighbors who had witnessed their humiliation in the backyard. When the dust finally settled on the legal proceedings, the silence that remained felt different. It didn't feel like the hollowed-out void I had encountered when I first walked into the house and saw the empty case. It felt earned. It felt like the quiet that follows a long, successful campaign. I spent my final weekend of leave helping my grandmother walk through the Savannah house one last time before the new owners took possession. We walked through the empty rooms, our footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. She ran her fingers along the banister, paused in the doorway of the living room, and glanced at the blank space on the wall where the display case had once stood. "Funny, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice echoing in the vacant space. They managed to clear out every stick of furniture, every rug, and every curtain, but they couldn't clear out the truth. That stays with the house. We walked out onto the porch and locked the front door for the last time. I handed the keys to the real estate agent, and we walked away without looking back. That evening, back at her apartment in Atlanta, she handed me one more folder. "I've updated the legacy trust," she said, her tone businesslike but her eyes warm. "Everything, the collection, the remaining funds from the recovery, and the properties left in my name, it's all been restructured. It's all protected now. No one, not even your parents on their best day, can touch a single cent or a single medal without your direct, written consent." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the legal language. My name appeared on almost every page, tied to a legacy that was now firmly under my control. "I didn't ask for all of this, Grandma," I said, feeling the weight of the responsibility. She smiled gently, a rare, genuine expression of affection. "Your grandfather didn't ask to be a general, Elias. He didn't ask to be a hero or to have his name engraved on brass plates. He earned those things by doing what was necessary when everyone else was looking for the easy way out. You've done the same." I thought about the months I had spent feeling small, believing that I had to swallow my anger and accept the betrayal just to keep the peace in a family that didn't respect me. I thought about the way I had let them make me feel like I was the difficult one for wanting what was rightfully mine. I thought about that empty glass case. And then I thought about the quiet, solid weight of the medals now resting safely in a new case in my own home. Some families survive for generations by pretending that everything is fine, by burying their secrets and their betrayals under a layer of polite conversation and expensive distractions. Mine had tried to do that, but they had failed. We had survived by being exposed, by having the light of the truth shine into the darkest corners of our relationships. And in that exposure, something I hadn't expected happened. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped asking for permission to be the man my grandfather knew I could be. The first night I spent back in my own place, with my grandfather's keepsake displayed properly on my own wall, I didn't turn on a single light. I sat in the darkness of the living room, let the shadows of the evening stretch across the floor, and watched the faint glow of the outside filter through the blinds. The medals rested inside a simple, elegant walnut frame, no dramatic spotlights, no velvet ostentation. The ceremonial dagger lay beneath them, its edge reflecting a sliver of silver light. And the letter, his letter, was tucked safely into its place, not hidden away in a safe, but respected as the foundational document of my life. For the first time since he'd passed away, I felt like I had truly brought him home. I stood there for a long time, my boots kicked off, my uniform jacket draped over a chair. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was full of the realization that I didn't need a Tesla, or a historic house, or the approval of people who saw my inheritance as a paycheck. I just needed the stillness of my own conscience. My grandmother came by the next afternoon, her movements a bit slower than they had been during the offensive, but her mind as sharp as a razor. She stood in front of the new display, studied it for a long, silent minute, and then nodded once. "He would approve, Elias," she said. "That was all the validation I would ever need." We sat at my small kitchen table, drinking tea that went cold while we talked about the mundane things of life. We talked about the humidity, the neighbor's golden retriever that wouldn't stop barking, and a new history book she had started reading. Then, eventually, she looked at me over the rim of her cup. "Your parents have been calling around," she said, her voice neutral. I didn't look up from my tea. "About what?" "About you," she replied. "They're asking mutual friends if you're still angry. They're trying to figure out if there is a way back into your good graces now that they've lost everything else." I thought about the question for a moment, really searching my heart for a trace of the old fury. "I'm not angry, Grandma," I said, and I realized I meant it. "Honestly, I'm just finished. There's a difference between being mad and being done. I've reached the end of that road." She smiled at that, a soft, knowing version of the smile. That is usually when people like your parents finally start to understand the damage they've caused, when they realize that the person they hurt isn't waiting for an apology anymore. "Do you think they'll ever truly get it?" I asked. She considered it for a long time, looking out the window at the Georgia pines. "They will understand the loss of the house. They will understand the loss of the car. Whether they ever understand why those things had to go, that is a much longer journey. Some people never make it to the destination." I nodded. That felt like a fair assessment. My sister Sarah sent me one last text message about a week later. It was surprisingly short, lacking her usual flair for drama or accusation. "I didn't know it would end like this," it read. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time, the blue light reflecting in the glass of the display case. I thought about the years we had spent as siblings, and the way those years had been traded for a luxury vehicle. I typed out a reply, my fingers steady. "Neither did Grandpa," I wrote back. "That's why he made sure I had the tools to fix it." She never replied, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone for a notification. I had reached a level of peace that didn't require her acknowledgement. Life moved on with the steady, unyielding pace of a military march. I went back to my full-duty cycle at Fort Stewart, back to the early morning formations where the mist clung to our uniforms, and back to the long days of training and discipline. I went back to the structure of a world where orders are given and followed, and where your word is your bond. But everything felt different now. I had a fundamental shift in my own internal geography. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who weren't actually listening. I stopped softening my voice to make others feel more comfortable with their own weaknesses. And I stopped believing that loyalty meant blind surrender to people who didn't value me. When I thought about my parents now, it wasn't with a burning rage or a desire for more revenge. It was with a profound sense of distance. The kind of distance a surveyor has when looking at a map of a territory they no longer inhabit. I could see the patterns of their behavior clearly once I was no longer trapped inside them. They hadn't stolen from me because they hated me. They had stolen from me because they believed my strength was a resource they could exploit. They believed I would endure the betrayal because I was strong enough to take it. They were right about my strength, but they were tragically wrong about my silence. One evening, several months after the house had been sold, I received a small, padded envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just a postmark from Atlanta. Inside was a single, vintage photograph I hadn't seen in decades. It was my grandfather, looking much younger, standing in his dress uniform beside my grandmother on a day that looked like a promotion ceremony. They were both looking directly into the lens of the camera, not smiling for the sake of the photo, not posing for an audience, but looking with a sense of absolute, unwavering certainty. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandmother's elegant, flowing handwriting, were 4 words that felt like a final commendation. "You did not flinch." I framed the photograph and placed it on the wall right beside the display case. It wasn't intended to be a shrine to the past, but a reminder for the future. It was a reminder that honor doesn't belong to the loudest or most demanding voice in the room. It was a reminder that family doesn't have the right to redefine your worth or liquidate your legacy for their own convenience. And most importantly, it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of preservation isn't an argument, it's the courage to let the truth finish what it started. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been told to stay quiet just to keep a fragile peace, or if you have watched someone mistake your resilience for permission to mistreat you, I would truly like to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let me know where you are watching from or which part of this family journey stayed with you the most. We share stories like this every day, stories about drawing lines in the sand, finding the truth, and the moments that fundamentally change who we are. If you don't want to miss the next one, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. We are walking this road together, one story at a time.